Part 2 of John Michael Greer's 2008 book, The Long Descent, narrated by Michael Dowd in 2016, with author and publisher permission.
Chapter 2. The Stories We Tell Ourselves. By this point, even those of my readers who haven't yet thrown this book at the nearest wall will likely be appalled by the image of the future presented in the last few pages. What I find most interesting about this very common reaction is that it can have its roots in two completely different, and in fact opposite, sets of assumptions and beliefs about the future. On the one hand, many people insist that no matter what problems crop up before us, modern science, technology, and raw human ingenuity will inevitably win out and make the world of the future better than the world today. On the other hand, some people insist that no matter what we do, some overwhelming catastrophe will soon bring civilization suddenly crashing down into mass death and a road warrior future. Discussions about peak oil and the predicament of industrial society constantly revolve around these two alternatives, as though they were the only possibilities. Many believers in either option don't seem to be able to wrap their minds around the possibility of a third alternative. It's a remarkable situation. If two meteorologists on a weather program were to get into a debate about the weather to be expected on a fall day, and one insisted the only possibility was clear skies and temperatures in the 90s, while the other claimed a sudden blizzard was about to happen, most viewers would probably suspect that something was out of kilter. Too many of today's discussions about the future of industrial society impose an equally strange distortion on the likely shape of the world our children and grandchildren will face. Blind spots of this sort show the hidden presence of myth. Many people nowadays think only primitive people believe in myths, but myths dominate the thinking of every society, including our own. Myths are the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of our world. Human beings think with stories as inevitably as they see with eyes and walk with feet. And the most important of these stories, the ones that define the nature of the world for those who tell them, are myths. Most ancient cultures took their myths directly from their religious ideas, using traditional stories about the gods and goddesses to make sense of their world. Editor's note, most stories of gods and goddesses are unconscious personifications, giving human characteristics to what's inescapably real. Our society does the same thing in a hole-and-corner way, dressing up an assortment of old religious ideas in the more fashionable garments of scientific theory or political ideology. Still, scratch the most up-to-date modern worldview or most casually held popular opinion, and anyone with a nodding acquaintance of traditional myths will recognize the underlying story at a glance. Progress and apocalypse. The two competing visions of the future just mentioned are no exception. You don't need to know anything about traditional mythology to recognize them. Unless you've been sleeping in a cave for the last 300 years, you know them inside and out. The first is the myth of progress. According to this story, all of human history is a grand tale of human improvement. From the primitive ignorance and savagery of our cave-dwelling ancestors, according to this myth, people climbed step by step up the ladder of progress, following in the wake of the evolutionary drive that raised us up from primeval slime and brought us to the threshold of human intelligence. Ever since our ancestors first became fully human, knowledge gathered over the generations made it possible for each culture to go further, become wiser, and accomplish more than the ones that came before it. With the coming of the scientific revolution 300 years ago, the slow triumph of reason over nature shifted into overdrive and has been accelerating ever since. Eventually, once the last vestiges of primitive superstition and ignorance are cast aside, our species will leap upward from the surface of its home planet and embrace its destiny among the stars. The second myth is the myth of the apocalypse. According to this story, all of human history is a tragic blind alley. At one time, people lived in harmony with their world, each other, and themselves. But that golden age ended with a disastrous wrong turn, and things have been going downhill ever since. The rise of vast, unnatural cities, governed by bloated governmental bureaucracies and inhabited by people who have abandoned spiritual values for a wholly material existence, mark the point of no return. Sometime soon, the whole rickety stricture will come crashing down, overwhelmed by sudden catastrophe, and billions of people will die as civilization comes apart and rampaging hordes scour the landscape. Only those who abandon a corrupt and doomed society and return to the old true ways of living will survive and build a better world. Both these myths have deep roots in the collective imagination of the modern world, and very few people nowadays seem to be able to think about the future at all without following one narrative or the other. It would be hard to find any two narratives less appropriate, though, for the future we are actually likely to encounter. Both of them rely on assumptions about the world that simply don't stand up to any sort of critical examination. The faith in progress, for example, rests on the unstated assumption that limits don't apply to us, because the forward momentum of human progress automatically trumps everything else. If we want limitless supplies of energy badly enough, the logic seems to be, the world will give it to us. Of course, the world did give it to us, in the form of unimaginably huge deposits of fossil fuels, storing hundreds of millions of years worth of photosynthesis, and we wasted it in a few centuries of fantastic extravagance. The lifestyles we've grown up treating as normal are entirely the products of that extravagance. This puts us in the position of a lottery winner who's spent millions of dollars in a few short years and is running out of money. The odds of hitting another $1 million jackpot are minute, and no amount of wishful thinking will enable us to keep our current lifestyle by getting a job at the local hamburger stand. Nor is the past quite so much a story of linear progress as the folklore of the industrial age would have it. Look back over the millennia that came before the start of the industrial age, straight back to the emergence of agriculture 10,000 years ago, and one of the most striking things you'll notice is how little life changed over that time. The lives of peasants, priests, soldiers, and aristocrats in Sumer in 3000 BCE, say, differed only in relatively minor details from those of their equivalents in the Zhou dynasty in China 15 centuries later, Roman North Africa 15 centuries after that, or medieval Spain another 15 centuries closer to our time. Tools gradually changed from stone to bronze to iron, and their shapes evolved with changes in technique. But the requirements of the agricultural cycle and the limited energy available from wind, water, biomass, and muscle imposed a common framework on human societies. While plenty of new technologies emerged over the millennia, the process of technological change was not a one-way street. Many technologies invented in periods of high innovation in the past were lost in later periods of regression. To this day, for example, nobody knows how the Egyptians cut, moved, and fitted the immense stone blocks of the pyramids. In the same way, the ingenious clockwork technology used in the Antikythera device, an ancient Greek machine for tracking planetary movements, was lost by the time Rome fell and had to be reinvented from scratch in the Renaissance. Before the harnessing of fossil fuels, technological advances were vulnerable to loss because they only had the most limited place in everyday life. Without cheap, abundant energy to power them, it was more efficient and economical for pre-modern societies to rely on human labor with hand tools for nearly all of their economic activities. This stable pattern changed only when the first steam engines allowed people to begin tapping the fantastic amounts of energy hidden away within the earth. The torrent of nearly free energy that followed those first discoveries played the crucial role in bringing the industrial world into being. For thousands of years before that time, everything else necessary for an industrial society had been part of the cultural heritage of most civilizations. Renewable energy sources, wind power, water power, biomass, and muscle power were all used extensively in the pre-industrial past without launching an industrial society. Scientific knowledge? The laws of mechanics were worked out in ancient times, and a Greek scientist even invented the steam turbine 2 centuries before the birth of Christ. Without fossil fuels, it was a useless curiosity. Human resourcefulness and ingenuity? It's as arrogant as it is silly to insist that people in past ages weren't as resourceful and ingenious as we are. Fossil fuel energy, and only fossil fuel energy, made it possible to break with the old agrarian pattern and construct the industrial world. Unless some new and equally abundant energy source comes online fast enough to make up for fossil fuel depletion, we will find ourselves back in the same world our ancestors knew, with the additional burdens of a huge surplus population and an impoverished planetary biosphere to contend with. Combine these constraints with the plain hard reality of vanishing fossil fuels, and the myth of perpetual progress becomes a mirage. That's a vitally important paragraph. I'm going to read it again. Fossil fuel energy and only fossil fuel energy made it possible to break with the old agrarian pattern and construct the industrial world. Unless some new and equally abundant energy source comes online fast enough to make up for fossil fuel depletion, we will find ourselves back in the same world our ancestors knew, with the additional burdens of a huge surplus population and an impoverished planetary biosphere to contend with. Combine these constraints with the plain hard reality of vanishing fossil fuels, and the myth of perpetual progress becomes a mirage. Believers in the apocalypse, for their part, insist that the end of industrial civilization will be sudden, catastrophic, and total. That claim is just as hard to square with the realities of our predicament as the argument for perpetual progress. Every previous civilization that has fallen has taken centuries to collapse, and there is no reason to think that the present case will be any different. The resource base of industrial society is shrinking, but it's far from exhausted. The impact of global warming and other ecological disruptions builds slowly over time, and governments and ordinary citizens alike have every reason to hold things together as long as possible. The history of the last century, think of the Great Depression, the Second World War, and the brutal excesses of communism and Nazism, just for starters, shows that industrial societies can endure tremendous disruption without dissolving into a Hobbesian war of all against all. People in hard times are far more likely to follow orders and hope for the best than to turn into the rampaging, mindless mobs that play so large a role in survivalist fantasies these days. The sorry history of the Y2K non-crisis a few years ago, a subject we'll be discussing in more detail in the next chapter, offers a useful reminder that claims of catastrophe can be overstated. But fantasy is often more appealing than reality, and most of the apocalyptic notions in circulation these days draw very heavily on popular fantasies. The idea, common just now among some Christians, that all good Christians will be raptured away to heaven just as the rest of the world goes to hell in a handbasket is a case in point. It's a lightly disguised fantasy of mass suicide. When you tell the kids that Grandma went to heaven to be with Jesus, most people understand what that means. And it also serves as a way for people to pretend to themselves that God will rescue them from the consequences of their own actions. That's one of history's all-time bad bets, but it's certainly been a popular one. The Hollywood notion of an overnight collapse is just as much of a fantasy. It makes for great screenplays, but has nothing to do with the realities of how civilizations fall. In the aftermath of Hubbard's peak, fossil fuel production will decline gradually, not simply come to a screeching halt. And so the likely course of things is a gradual descent rather than free fall, following the same trajectory marked out by so many civilizations in the past. Nor does decline necessarily proceed at a steady pace. Between sudden crises, some come intervals of relative stability, even moderate improvement. Different regions decline at different paces. Existing social, economic, and political structures are replaced not with complete chaos, but with transitional structures that may themselves develop pretty fair institutional strength. Does this model of punctuated decline apply to the current situation? Almost certainly. As oil and gas run short, economies will come unglued and political systems disintegrate under the strain. Nonetheless, there will still be oil to be had. The Hubbard's curve is a bell-shaped curve, after all, and if the peak comes in 2010, the world in 2040 will be producing about as much oil as it was producing in 1980. With other fossil fuels well along their own Hubbert curves, nearly twice as many people to provide for, and a global economy dependent on cheap, abundant energy in serious trouble, the gap between production and demand will become a potent source, driving poverty, spiraling shortages, rising death rates, plummeting birth rates, and epidemic violence and warfare. Granted, this is not a pretty picture, but it's not an instant reversion to the Stone Age either. It's reasonable, of course, to consider sudden catastrophe and continued progress as possibilities for the future, but both of these narratives have to be weighed against the realities of our present situation and the evidence of history. In our present context, both possibilities require a deus ex machina on a grand scale to change the course of events. Ordinary catastrophes aren't enough to bring industrial society down overnight, just as ordinary technological progress isn't enough to get industrial society out of the mess it's made for itself. Without some extraordinary event, our civilization is headed down the well-trodden path of decline. If there's a point in planning for the future at all, it makes sense to plan for the one that we're most likely to get. Both the myth of inevitable progress and the myth of imminent apocalypse, on the other hand, have a great deal of emotional power. That's why they're popular. Faith in perpetual progress comforts those people who have made their peace with society as it is and want to believe that the frustrations and compromises of their lives are part of a process that will eventually lead to better things. Faith in imminent apocalypse comforts those people who cannot accept society as it is. They long for a catastrophe massive enough to topple the proud towers of a civilization they loathe. Still, the fact that a belief is emotionally powerful and comforting doesn't make it true. Secondhand Theologies. The central theme of both these myths, the narrative of progress just as much as the narrative of apocalypse, is the process that the philosopher Eric Voegelin called immentizing the eschaton. This process underlies a remarkable amount of popular thought these days, and it's worth taking the time to understand what it means and how it works. The word eschaton comes from an old Greek word for end or border. In Christian theological jargon, it refers to the process by which the fallen world we experience today will someday give way to the eternal blessedness of the kingdom of God. An entire branch of theology called eschatology, literally the science of the end, evolved over the last 2,000 years or so in an attempt to piece together a coherent vision of the future out of the hints and visions provided by Scripture and tradition. It's a lively field, full of fierce disputes, and no consensus about the end times has yet found general acceptance among Christian theologians or ordinary believers. Central to nearly all Christian accounts of the eschaton, however, is the idea that it's something completely outside the realm of history as we know it. When the trumpet sounds, the sky tears open, and something wholly other comes through. There's a long and complicated history behind this belief, reaching back half a dozen centuries before the Common Era, when the religions across much of the Old World started offering believers the promise of a way out of the cycles of time and the world of suffering, and a way into the eternal realm of perfection. For the most part, the escape hatch from time was seized only for individuals. The Buddhist pursuit of nirvana and the Gnostic quest to return to an ionic world of light are good examples of the theme. In a handful of traditions, though, this muted into the idea that the whole world would enter eternity at a specific point in the future. Ordinary history would stop and be replaced by something wholly other. The Jewish vision of the coming Messianic age is among the oldest of these. Adapted by Christianity, it became the prophecy of the Second Coming, and in this latter form it remains a potent myth throughout much of the Western world. In theologians' language, the quality of otherness that pervades visions of the Second Coming and its equivalents is called transcendence. Its opposite is immanence. One of the great quarrels in theology is whether God or the gods are transcendent, that is, outside nature and free of its limitations, or immanent, that is, part of nature and subject to its laws. Like most such divisions, this one admits of several different kinds of middle ground, but the basic distinction is relevant. People who have mystical experiences, which are, after all, common among human beings, very often comment on a difference between the ordinary reality of their lives and the non-ordinary reality that surges into their consciousness. Did the non-ordinary reality come from someone, something, or somewhere outside ordinary experience? Or was it right here, unnoticed all the time? That's the difference between transcendence and immanence. Most religions that put a great deal of attention into eschatology also have a transcendent concept of the divine. The whole point of the eschaton is that ordinary reality dissolves into the holy other. Most religions that have an immanent concept of the divine, in turn, either have no eschatology at all, or make the end of the world a recurring event in an endlessly repeated cycle of time. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, with their transcendent God and richly detailed eschatologies, fall on one side of the divide. Religions such as Hinduism, with its universes that bud, blossom, and fall through infinite cycles of time, and Shinto, which has no eschatology at all, fall on the other. So does Druid spirituality I practice, which recognizes the presence of spirit throughout the world of nature and sees spiritual awakening as something that comes to each soul in its own proper time. Now and then, though, the two patterns collide and cross-fertilize, and the resulting belief systems locate the eschaton as a possibility to be realized within ordinary history, or even the inevitable result of the working out of historical patterns. The scientific revolution of the 17th century, more than anything else, was responsible for putting this new wrinkle in the old myth. To the founders and early propagandists of modern science, human beings didn't need to wait for God to bring on the New Jerusalem. It could be built here and now by harnessing the power of human reason to dominate the world of nature. As a newfound faith in progress redefined the past as a tale of the slow triumph of reason over nature, the Western world embraced a paradoxical vision in which history itself brought about an end of history. Focused through thinkers as different as Hegel and Terence McKenna, this way of thinking about history still remains welded into place in the conventional wisdom throughout our society. For people at all points on the cultural spectrum, as a result, the perfect society remains firmly parked in the near future, accessible once the right set of political, social, or spiritual policies are put in place. Marxism offers an example familiar to most people nowadays. In Marxist theory, history is determined by changes in the mode of production that unfold in a fixed order, from primitive communism through slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, to the proletarian revolution and the everlasting communist utopia of the future. While all this is wrapped in the jargon of 19th century materialist science, it's not hard to see the religious underpinnings of the theory, because every element in Marxist theory has an exact equivalent in Christian eschatology. Primitive communism is Edom. The invention of private property is the original sin that caused the fall. The stages of slavery, feudalism, and capitalism are the various dispensations of sacred history, and so on, right up to the second coming of the proletariat, the millennial state of socialism, and the final arrival of communism as a New Jerusalem descending from some dialectic materialist heaven. Point for point, it's a rephrasing of Christian myth that replaces the transcendent dimensions with forces immanent in ordinary history. Over the last 3 centuries or so, Christianity's influence on the Western intellect has crumpled beneath the assaults of scientific materialism. But no mythology has yet succeeded in ousting it from its place in Western imagination. I'm going to say this again. Over the last 3 centuries or so, Christianity's influence on the Western intellect has crumpled beneath the assaults of scientific materialism. But no mythology has yet succeeded in ousting it from its place in the Western imagination. The result has been a flurry of attempts to rehash Christian myth under other, more materialistic names. The mythology of progress itself is one example of this sort of secondhand theology. Marxism is another, and most of the more recent myths of apocalypse reworked the Christian narrative along the same lines that Marx did, swapping out the economic concepts Marx imported to the myth for some other set of ideas more appealing to them or more marketable to the public. Neo-primitive theorists such as John Zerzan and Daniel Quinn, for example, replace Marxist economics with anthropology. For them, the hunter-gatherer societies of the prehistoric past are Eden. The invention of agriculture is the original sin that led to the fall, and so on, with the imminent collapse of civilization filling the role of the apocalyptic transformation, after which the righteous remnant enters the New Jerusalem of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. In exactly the same way, the reworked liberalism of David Corton's The Great Turning fills Eden's role with a set of hypothetical prehistoric matriarchies, the fall with the emergence of the principle of empire, and so forth, right up to the Great Turning toward a liberal ideology that stands in the place of the Second Coming. In these and many other examples of the same type, ideologies presented as radical new visions turn out on closer inspection to be Christian apocalyptic myth with the serial numbers filed off, with new actors in new costumes filling the same old roles. Now, I'm no great fan of mainstream Christianity myself. To me, all its myths and symbols put together don't carry the spiritual impact of one blue heron flying through the dawn mists or a single autumn sunset seen through old-growth cedars. That's why I follow a druid path. Still, it seems to me that if people insist on thinking in terms of the Christian myth, they might as well go the rest of the way and embrace Christianity as a whole. That way, at least, they would have the benefit of 2 millennia worth of Christian philosophy and theology, rather than having to make do with hand-me-downs from Marx, say, or the modern pundits mentioned above. They might also be able to learn a few lessons from Christian history, or any other kind of history for that matter, about the problems that follow when people try to immanentize the eschaton. It's one thing to try to sense the shape of the future in advance, and to make constructive changes in your life to prepare for its rougher possibilities. It's quite another to become convinced that you know where history is headed, and to insist that the kind of society you like best is also the inevitable result of the historical process. When the course you've marked out for history simply projects the trajectory of a too familiar myth onto the inkblot patterns of the future, immanentizing the eschaton can all too easily become a recipe for self-induced disaster. History is littered with the wreckage of movements that convinced themselves that the world was about to be transformed into what they wanted it to be. Not uncommonly, such wreckage includes a troubled heap of human lives. The trajectory of Marxism, from the bright dreams for a better future of 19th century intellectuals to the 20th century nightmares of Stalin's purges, the Cultural Revolution, and the killing fields in Cambodia, is a route followed all too often by those who believe they know which way history is headed. Myths of Utopia. Each of the modern ideologies that immanentize the eschaton have recast Christian theology in apparently secular forms, but complex transformations shaped the way they manhandled their borrowed myths. In its original form, the Christian narrative of sacred history includes some features close to the myth of progress and others much closer to the modern apocalypticism. As sociologist Philip Lamy showed in his useful study, the old myth has been shattered into fragmentary versions over the last century or two. Many people nowadays, including many Christians, have abandoned the complexity of traditional sacred history for a fractured myth that focuses on some small part of the whole. The contemporary myths of progress and apocalypse are good examples, the former stressing the hope of future bliss, the latter the threat of catastrophe. The myth of progress, in effect, fast-forwards Christian sacred history to the 1,000 years that are supposed to come between the Second Coming and the arrival of the New Jerusalem. The redeeming revelation has already happened in the form of the scientific revolution. The allegedly primitive past has been stretched and lopped to make it look like a veil of tears, and today's scientists fill the role of the church expectant, waiting on the great God progress to bring Utopia in its own good time. By contrast, the myth of apocalypse fast-forwards the Christian myth to the last days of the tribulation, and proclaims that some version of the Second Coming is about to overthrow capitalism, civilization, the Republican Party, or whatever other surrogate fills Satan's role in their mythology. There's some complicated cultural history behind the split between progressive and apocalyptic myth. A little over 4 centuries ago, at the time of the Reformation, mainstream Christianity effectively capitulated to rational materialist philosophy and redefined the deep mythic narratives of the Bible as secular history. Before then, most theologians discussed what events described in the book of Revelation meant as mystical symbols and analogies. Afterward, most of them argued instead about when and how the same events would happen as historical events in the everyday world. Out of the resulting debates came 2 main schools of thought. The first, the premillennialist position, held that Jesus would return and bring about the millennium, a 1,000-year period of bliss when Christians would rule the world. The other party, the post-millenarianists, argued instead that Christians would rule the world for 1,000 years of bliss, and after that Jesus would return. The difference may seem about as relevant as the number of angels that can dance on the head of the late Jerry Falwell, but each viewpoint has sweeping implications. If the post-millenarialists are right, history is on their side, since they're destined to rule the world for 1,000 years before Jesus gets here. Thus, post-millenarianists tend to believe that things are on the right track and will get better over time until the millennium arrives. If the pre-millenarianists are right, on the other hand, history is on Satan's side, since it will take nothing less than the personal intervention of Jesus himself to give the Christians their 1,000 years of world rule. Accordingly, premillennialists tend to believe that things are on the wrong track and will get worse over time until when everything is as bad as it gets, Jesus shows up, beats the stuffing out of the devil and his minions, and brings on the millennium. Drop the theological fine print from these 2 viewpoints, and you've got the myth of progress and the myth of the apocalypse in their contemporary forms. Believers in progress argue that industrial civilization is better than any other in history and destined to get better still, so long as we just keep putting enough money into scientific research or get government out of the way of industry or whatever else they believe will keep history on its course. Believers in apocalypse argue that industrial civilization is worse than any other in history, and its present difficulties will end in an overnight catastrophe that will destroy it and usher in whatever better world their mythology promises them. A better world in which they will inevitably have the privileged place denied them in this one. Both these mythic narratives, in other words, are myths of utopia. Both promise that the future will bring a much better world than the present. Their only disagreements are about how to get there and how closely the utopia to come resembles the society that we've now got. Thus, it's not surprising that believers in progress tend to be those who feel they benefit from the current social order, and believers in the apocalypse tend to be those who feel marginalized by the current social order and excluded from its benefits. Either way, the lure of utopia is a potent force, one that has deep roots in our culture and our collective psyche. It is also one of the primary obstacles that stand in the way of a constructive response to the crisis of industrial society. The lesson of limits to growth, a lesson most people have been doing their best to avoid learning with increasing desperation since the early 1970s, is that the age of cheap, abundant energy is passing, and nothing we or anyone else can do will keep it here or bring it back. We can't count on the future to bring us a better world, via progress, apocalyptic collapse, or any combination of the two. Rather, we can count on it to bring us a world of hard ecological limits, restricted opportunities, and lowered expectations, in which many of our fondest dreams will have to be set aside for the foreseeable future, or forever. It's a world where hopes can still be realized, dreams can still be pursued, and the experience of being human can still be contemplated and celebrated. But all these things will have to be on a much more modest scale than the experience of the recent past or the utopian dreams that either the progressive or the apocalyptic myth have prepared for us to consider. During the 3 centuries of industrial expansion, utopian thinking was adaptive. To use the ecologist jargon, it encouraged people to think big at a time when the soaring availability of fossil fuel energy made explosive growth pay off. As the industrial age peaks and begins to decline, the equation is reversing. In a world where energy and all other non-renewable resources are likely to get progressively more scarce and expensive, it's time to learn, again, how to think small. And that process will be much easier if we say farewell to utopia and focus on the things that we can actually achieve in the stark limits of time and resources we still have left. Now, rather than rereading those previous 3 paragraphs, I'm just going to invite the listener to rewind for the last 5 minutes and listen to it again. Knowing only one story. One of the things that makes our culture's reliance on the utopian myth of progress and apocalypse so problematic as we approach the end of the age of cheap energy is that both narratives claim to explain the entire universe. Universal claims of this sort have become popular in recent centuries, but from a wider historical perspective, stories that claim to be the answer to everything are something of a novelty. Traditional cultures around the world, in fact, have a very large number of stories, and much of the education received by young people in those cultures consists of sharing, learning, and thinking about those stories. The stories handed down in oral cultures aren't simply entertainment, any more than are the stories we tell ourselves about the universe today. Stories are probably the oldest and most important of all human tools. Human beings think with stories, fitting what William James called the booming, buzzing confusion of the universe around us into narrative patterns that make the world make sense. We use stories to tell us who we are, what the world is like, and what we can and can't do with our lives. Every culture has its stories, and if you pay careful attention to the stories a culture tells, you can grasp things about that culture that nothing else will teach you. I gotta repeat that. This is too good. The stories handed down in oral cultures aren't simply entertainment any more than are the stories that we tell ourselves about the universe today. Stories are probably the oldest and most important of all human tools. Human beings think with stories, fitting what William James called the blooming, buzzing confusion of the universe around us into narrative patterns that make the world make sense. We use stories to tell us who we are, what the world is like, and what we can and can't do with our lives. Every culture has its stories, and if you pay careful attention to the stories a culture tells, you can grasp things about the culture that nothing else will teach you. One of the most striking things about old stories of traditional cultures, is that no two of them have the same moral. If you were born in an English-speaking culture, for example, you likely grew up with the last remnant of England's old stories in the form of fairy tales that put different people in different situations, with very different results. Sometimes violating a prohibition brought success. Think Jack and the Beanstalk. But sometimes it brought disaster. Sleeping Beauty. Sometimes victory went to the humble and patient, Cinderella. But sometimes it went to the one who had the chutzpah to dare the impossible, Puss in Boots. Common themes run through the old stories, of course, but they never take the same shape twice. Those differences are a great source of power. If you have a wealth of different stories to think with, odds are that whatever the world throws at you, you'll be able to find a narrative pattern that makes sense of it. Over the last few centuries, though, the multiple narrative approach of traditional cultures has given way, especially in the industrial West, to a way of thinking that privileges a single story above all others. Think of any currently popular political or religious ideology, and you'll likely find at its center the claim that one and only one story explains everything in the world. For fundamentalist Christians, it's the story of the fall and redemption, ending with the second coming of Christ. For Marxists, it's the story of dialectical materialism, ending with the dictatorship of the proletariat. For believers in any of the flotilla of apocalyptic ideologies cruising the waterways of the modern imagination, it's another version of the same story, with different falls from grace ending in redemption through different catastrophes. For rationalists, neoconservatives, most scientists, and many other people in the developed world, the one true story is the story of progress. The political left and right each has its own story, and the list goes on. From the perspective of traditional cultures, believers in these ideologies are woefully undereducated. since for all practical purposes they know only one story. This modern habit of knowing only one story has certain predictable results. One of these is that the story itself becomes invisible to those who believe in it. From their perspective, their story isn't a story, it's simply the way things are. And the fact that it copies other versions of the same story is irrelevant, since their story is true and the others aren't. Often the story becomes so much a part of everyday thinking that it vanishes from sight entirely, becoming a presupposition that may never be stated or even noticed by those who build their lives around it. The myth of progress, a sterling example, has become so pervasive nowadays that few people notice how completely it dominates current thinking about the future. Speaking about historians of his own time who embraced the mythology of progress, the great 20th century historian Arnold Toynbee wrote, quote, "The difference between these post-Christian Western historians and their Christian predecessors is that the moderns do not allow themselves to be aware of the pattern in their minds, whereas Bossuet, Eusebius, and St. Augustine were fully conscious of it. If one cannot think without mental patterns, and in my belief, one cannot, it is better to know what they are, for a pattern of which one is unconscious is a pattern that holds one at its mercy." Unquote. While the story itself may become invisible, its implications are anything but, and this leads to the second symptom of knowing only one story: the certainty that whatever problem comes up, it has one and only one solution. For fundamentalist Christians, no matter what the problem, the solution is surrendering your will to Jesus, or more to the point, to the guy who claims to be able to tell you who Jesus wants you to vote for. For Marxists, the one solution for all problems is proletarian revolution. For neoconservatives, it's the free market. For scientists, it's more scientific research and education. For Democrats, it's electing Democrats. For Republicans, it's electing Republicans, and so on. What makes this fixation on a single solution so problematic is that the universe is what ecologists call a complex system. In a complex system, feedback loops with unexpected consequences make a mockery of simplistic attempts to predict effects from causes. No one solution will effectively respond to more than a small portion of the challenges the system can throw at you. This leads to the third symptom of knowing only one story: repeated failure. Recent economic history offers a good example. For the last 2 decades, free market advocates in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, have been pushing a particular set of economic policies on governments and economies around the world, insisting that these are the one and only one solution to every economic ill. Everywhere these policies have been fully implemented, the result has been economic and social disaster. Think East Asia in the late 1980s, or Russia and Latin America in the 1990s. And every one of the countries devastated by the results has returned to prosperity only after junking the policies in question. None of this has stopped the free market's true believers from continuing to press forward toward the imaginary utopia their story promises them. For those who know plenty of stories and know how to think with them, the complexity of the universe is much easier to deal with, because they have a much larger chance of being able to recognize what story the universe seems to be following and act accordingly. Those who don't know any stories at all, if such improbable beings actually exist, may still get by, even though they don't have the resources of story wisdom to draw on. They may still be able to judge the situation on its own merits and act accordingly, because a lack of stories at least offers some hope of flexibility. Those who know only one story, though, and are committed to the idea that the world makes sense if and only if it's interpreted through the filter of that one story, are stuck in a rigid stance with no options for change. Much more often than not, they fail, since the complexity of the universe is such that no single story makes a useful tool for understanding more than a very small part of it. If they can recognize this and let go of their story, they can begin to learn. If you've gotten your ego wrapped up in the idea that you know the one and only true story, on the other hand, and you try to force the world to fit your story rather than allowing your story to change to fit the world, the results will not be good. This leads to the fourth symptom of knowing only one story: rage. The third symptom, failure, can be a gift because it offers the opportunity for learning. But if the gift is too emotionally difficult to accept, the easy way out is to take refuge in anger. When we get angry with people who disagree with us about politics or religion, I'm coming to think, very often what really angers us is the fact that our preferred story doesn't fit the universe everywhere and always, and those who disagree with us simply remind us of that uncomfortable fact. Plenty of pundits, and many others as well, have commented on the extraordinary level of anger that surges through America these days. From talk radio to political debates to everyday conversations, dialogue has given way to diatribe across the political spectrum. It's unlikely to be a coincidence that this has happened over a quarter century, when the grand narratives of both major American political parties failed the test of reality. The 1960s and 1970s saw the Democrats get their chance to enact the reforms they wanted. The 1980s and the first decade of the 21st century saw the Republicans get the same opportunity. Both parties found themselves stymied by a universe that obstinately refused to play along with their stories, and both sides turned in anger and scapegoating as a way to avoid having to rethink their ideas. That habit of rage isn't going to help us, or anyone, as we move toward a future that promises to leave most of our culture's familiar stories in tatters. As we face the unwelcome realities of the limits to growth, clinging to whatever single story appeals to us may be emotionally comforting in the short term, but it leads to a dead end familiar to those who study the history of extinct civilizations. Learning other stories, and learning that it's possible to see the world in many ways, is a more viable path, but it can be a challenging one that many people can't or won't take. Faustus and the monkey trap. The modern habit of trying to fit all of reality into a single story, whether that's the myth of progress, the myth of the apocalypse, or any other, forms one of the mainsprings behind industrial society's failure to deal with the limits to growth. Albert Einstein commented that it's impossible to solve a problem with the same sort of thinking that created it, and this dictum has rarely been so relevant as it is today. In particular, many of today's attempts to do something about peak oil rely on the same thinking and derive from the same story that got us into our present predicament. The habits of thought turn out solutions, quote unquote, guaranteed to make our situation worse than it already is. Of the dozens of good examples in the daily news, the one that seems most worth noting right now is the economic blowback set in motion by the U.S. government's attempt to bolster its faltering petroleum-driven economy with ethanol. As corn and other grains get diverted from grocery stores to gas tanks, commodity prices spike. Inflation ripples outward through the economic food chain, and poor people around the world face the prospect of starvation. More than 20 years ago, William Catton pointed out in his seminal classic, Overshoot, that the downslope of industrial society would force human beings to compete against their own machines for dwindling resource stocks. His prediction has become today's reality. Editor's note, as I said at the beginning of this recording, Connie Barlow, my wife, and I both consider William Catton's Overshoot to be the single most important book we've ever read in our lives. If you go to our main website, thegreatstory.org, thegreatstory.org, and click on Grace Limits, you'll get there. I've got the whole of Catton's Overshoot recorded. You can also Google Grace Limits audios. I've got much of John Michael Greer's writings recorded there as well as a whole bunch of others. It's all very reminiscent of an old metaphor much used in cognitive psychology. Many centuries ago in Southeast Asia, some clever soul figured out how to use the thinking pattern of monkeys to make a highly effective monkey trap. The trap is a gourd with a hole in one end just big enough for the monkey's hand to fit in, and a stout rope connected to the other end, which is fastened to a stake in the ground. Into the gourd goes a piece of some food prized by monkeys, large and solid enough that it can't be shaken out of the gourd. You set the trap in a place monkeys frequent and wait. Sooner or later, a monkey comes along, smells the food, and puts its hand into the gourd to grab it. The hole is too small to allow the monkey to extract hand and food together, though, and the rope and the stake keeps the monkey from hauling it away, and the monkey keeps trying to get the food out in its hand. Meanwhile, you come out of hiding and head toward the monkey with a net, if there's a market for live monkeys, or with something more deadly, if there isn't. Instead of dropping the food and scampering toward the safety of the nearest tree, most monkeys will frantically keep trying to wrestle the food out of the gourd until the net snares it or the club comes whistling down. The trap works because monkeys, like the rest of us, tend to become so focused on pursuing immediate goals by familiar means that they lose track of the wider context of priorities that make those goals and means meaningful in the first place. I'm going to say that again. This monkey trap works because monkeys, like the rest of us, tend to become so focused on pursuing immediate goals by familiar means that they lose track of the wider context of priorities that make those goals and means meaningful in the first place. In the terms used earlier in this chapter, the monkey gets stuck in a single story, failing to notice that there may be more options than the obvious one. Once the monkey smells the food in the gourd, it defines the problem as how to get the food out, and it tries to solve the problem in a familiar way by manipulating the food and the gourd. When the hunter appears, that simply adds a note of urgency and makes the problem appear to be how to get the food out before the hunter arrives. Phrased in either of these terms, the problem is impossible to solve. Only if the monkey remembers that food is of no value to a dead monkey and redefines the problem as primarily a matter of getting away from the hunter, will it let go of the food, get its hand out of the trap, and run for the nearest tree. The monkey trap may not look like a theme for great literature, but exactly the same dilemma forms the main plot engine of Christopher Marlowe's classic play, Dr. Faustus. In Marlowe's vision, Faustus is an intellectual maniac who has mastered all the scholarship of his time and dismisses it as worthless because he can't cash it in for power. So he conjures the devil Mephistopheles, who offers him 24 years of power over the world of appearances in exchange for his immortal soul. Faustus gladly makes the bargain and proceeds to run riot for the better part of 9 scenes, with the ever-obsequious Mephistopheles always ready to fulfill his every wish but one. Finally, the 24 years are up, and at the stroke of midnight, a crew of devils swoops down on Faustus and hauls them off to hell. All this came to Marlowe out of the folk literature that gave him the raw materials for his play. What makes Marlowe's retelling of the story one of Elizabethan England's great dramas, though, is his insight into the psychology of Faustus's damnation. Faustus spends nearly the entire play a heartbeat away from escaping the devil's pact that ultimately drags him to his doom. All he has to do is renounce the pact and all its powers and pleasures it brings him, and salvation is his. But this is exactly what he cannot do. He becomes so focused on his sorcerer's power, so used to getting what he wants by ordering Mephistopheles around, that the possibility of getting anything any other way slips out of his grasp. Even at the very end, as the devils drag him away, the last words that burst from his lips are a cry for Mephistopheles to save him. The logic of the monkey trap underlies the entire scenario, because the monkey and Faustus trap themselves in essentially the same way. Both have a proven track record of solving problems using a specific method. The monkey by manipulating things with its hands, Faustus by summoning Mephistopheles and having him take care of it. Both keep on trying to use their familiar set of problem-solving tools, even when they clearly don't work. Even when the real shape of the problem becomes clear, and breaking out of the old way of thinking becomes a question of immediate survival, they keep on struggling to make the problem fit their choice of solutions, rather than adjusting their solution to the actual problem. Mephistopheles and the monkey hunter have a critical ally here, and its name is stress. It's one thing to step back and take stock of a situation when there's plenty of time and no sign of danger. It's quite another thing to do so in the presence of an imminent threat to survival. Once the true shape of the situation appears, stress reactions hardwired into the nervous system of men and monkeys alike cut in, making it very difficult indeed to reassess the situation and consider alternative ways of dealing with it. The final scene of Marlowe's drama expresses this dilemma with shattering intensity. As midnight approaches, Faustus tries every means of escaping his fate except the one that can actually save him. The same dilemma on a much larger scale underlies current efforts to deal with the imminent decline of world oil production by finding something else to pour into our gas tanks: ethanol, biodiesel, hydrogen, you name it. Our petroleum-powered vehicles, not just cars, but the trucks, trains, ships, and aircraft that make our current way of life possible, are the food in the monkey's hand and the pack that binds Mephistopheles to Faustus's service. Even in the peak oil community, the problem of peak oil is too often framed as how to find some other way to keep the fuel tanks topped up. This seems like common sense, but that's what the monkey thinks about getting the food out of the gourd, too. Approached as a question of finding something to fill our gluttonous appetite for highly concentrated energy, the problem of peak oil is just as insoluble as the monkey trap when that's approached as a question of getting food. The discovery and exploitation of the Earth's petroleum reserves gave human beings a fantastic windfall of essentially free energy, and we proceeded to burn through it at an astonishing pace. Now that the supply of petroleum is beginning to falter, the question before us is not how to keep burning something else at the same pace, or how to find some other way to power a civilization of a sort that can only survive by burning extravagant amounts of energy, but rather how to scale back our expectations and our technology enough to make them work within the limits of the same renewable sources our ancestors had 400 years ago. I'm going to read that paragraph again. Approached as a question of finding something to fill our gluttonous appetite for highly concentrated energy, the problem of peak oil is just as insoluble as the monkey trap when that's approached as a question of getting food. The discovery and exploitation of Earth's petroleum reserves gave human beings a fantastic windfall of essentially free energy, and we proceeded to burn through it at an astonishing pace. Now that the supply of petroleum is beginning to falter, the question before us is not how to keep burning something else at the same pace, or how to find some other way to power a civilization of a sort that can only survive by burning extravagant amounts of energy, but rather how to scale back our expectations and our technology enough to make them work within the limits of the same renewable sources our ancestors had 400 years ago. I've suggested earlier in this book that expecting some other energy resource to provide energy on the same scale and level of concentration that petroleum does, just because we happen to want one, is a little like responding to one huge lottery win by assuming that when the money starts running out, another equally large win can be had for the cost of a few more tickets. This is close enough to today's consumer psychology that it's easy to imagine somebody in this position pouring all the money he has left into lottery tickets, throwing away his chances of avoiding bankruptcy because the only solution he can imagine is winning the lottery again. And this again is exactly the mentality of current attempts to fuel industrial society by pouring our food supply into our gas tanks. Faustus may be a better model for the emerging crisis than the monkey because the predicament we face, like his, is precisely the result of what we're best at. Faustus became so dependent on his attendant devils that he lost track of the possibility that he could do something without them. Replace devils with machines, and the parallel is exact. We have become so used to solving problems by throwing energy-intensive technologies at them that when technologies themselves become the crux of a predicament, we have no idea what to do. If any of the achievements of the last 3 centuries are to be salvaged from the approaching spiral of crises, we need to rethink this now, before the social, economic, and political stresses become so pressing that clear thought becomes impossible and fossil fuel spirits appear, on schedule, to drag us off to the close equivalent of the hell of Marlowe's play. Distracting ourselves. The problem of the monkey trap is already a potent factor in contemporary society. Watch the way the pundits and politicians keep trying to solve today's crises with yesterday's solutions, no matter how counterproductive the results, and it's hard not to see a reflection of the poor monkey trying to get its hand out of the trap without letting go of the food that keeps it stuck there. The old saying, when you realize that you're in a hole, the first thing to do is stop digging, has some relevance here. Easy to say, this can be hard to put into practice, especially when digging has been so successful and so profitable for so long that it's the only thing that you really know how to do anymore. Yet the monkey trap fastened to the hand of modern industrial society has implications not often recognized. It's best to come at this one in a roundabout way, so I'll begin from an unlikely starting point and talk a bit about the history of the New Age movement. It's common these days for people to roll their eyes when New Age or any of the movements of thought associated with it come up for discussion. This fashionable scorn, though, leads many of us to miss the chance to watch a crucial barometer of social trends. In any civilization, it's the cults, fads, and passions on the fringe that point out the roads that the rest of society will presently take. In any civilization, it's the cults, fads, and passions of the fringe that point out roads that the rest of society will presently take. If some prescient Roman scholar of the reign of Nero or Claudius, say, wanted to catch some whisper of the world that would supplant his own, he'd have been wasting his time listening to speeches in the forum or lectures in the fashionable academies of the day. Instead, he would have to search out the cultural underbelly of his age, where strange cults from distant lands bid for loyalties of those long since alienated from the worship of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. The Middle Ages already existed there in larval form, long before anyone in Rome had ever heard of Goths or the Huns, or thought of Jesus of Nazareth as anything but a footnote in the history of a minor province somewhere back east. The New Age movement is unlikely to become, for the coming deindustrial age, what Christianity became during and after Rome's collapse. If it had an equivalent in the classical sense, it would be the Gnostic movement. Like the New Age, Gnosticism was a diffuse and wildly diverse phenomenon that was popular among the privileged classes of its time, and reflected the attitudes and interests of those classes far too closely to survive the collapse of society that gave them their status. Gnosticism's Achilles' heel was its intense spiritual elitism, its rigid distinction between the few who had the capacity for gnosis, redeeming knowledge, and the many who did not. The New Age movement formulates its notions of privilege in a different way, but these notions are still central to the movement. Like the Gnostics, the New Age movement drew heavily on older traditions. Despite its name, there was never much new about it. Nearly all its ingredients were first assembled by the spiritualist movement in the mid-19th century, channeling, they called it mediumship back then, alternative health systems, positive thinking psychology, an intense reverence for the wisdom of the East that never quite stooped to learn much about Asian spiritual teachings, and other key elements. By the 1950s, when the New Age movement began to coalesce, this package was the common property of a dizzying range of alternative spiritualities in the Western world, many of which had apocalyptic mythologies of the sort already discussed in this chapter. Like other apocalyptic faiths, the belief system made the trip from grand announcements of the imminent arrival of a new world to embarrassed excuses for its failure to appear. One of the classics of modern sociology, When Prophecy Fails, came out of a prime example of this sort of apocalyptic embarrassment from the 1950s. Against this backdrop of repeated failure, though, some of the leading figures of the nascent New Age community came up with a novel gambit. They proposed that believers should live their lives in the ordinary world as if the New Age had already arrived. By making the prophesied great change a reality in their own lives, here and now, they hope to catalyze it in the world as a whole. It's a brilliant strategy, for more than one reason. To begin with, making changes in your own life is the necessary first step toward making them at any other level of society. Gandhi's commitment, you must be the change you hope to see in the world, is as much a guide to effective tactics as anything else. Yet there's more going on here than clever politics. Another factor at work is a very old but very potent technique for shaping consciousness. Put the ideal and the real cheek by jowl and learn to live with the cognitive dissonance between them, and the paradox itself can become a source of creativity and insight. It's been a core technique in the toolkit of initiatory schools since ancient times. Whether the original New Age communities got the idea from the old initiatory traditions or stumbled across it on their own, it quickly caught fire and spread across alternative scenes throughout the industrial world. The strategy of paradox has a vulnerability, though. There's always the risk of losing track of the as-if, the gap between the ideal world and the real one where creative paradox lives, and starting to believe that the ideal world is the one that actually exists. That way lies the feudal heroics of Don Quixote, who maps the ideal world of chivalric romance onto the prosaic realities of the Spanish countryside with such abandon that he tries to assault windmills under the delusion that they're wicked giants. Of course, the windmills fail to play their assigned role in the romance and clobber him. Something similar happened to the New Age movement because it became less visionary and more marketable, and the subtle discipline of live as though you're creating the reality you experience got dumbed down into you create the reality you experience. Again, something similar happened to the New Age movement as it became less visionary and more marketable, and the subtle discipline of live as though you're creating the reality you experience got dumbed down into you create the reality you experience. Of course, each of us does play a part in creating the reality we experience. Subtle factors such as expectations and assumptions have a much more powerful role in the way our lives turn out than most people realize. In the first stages of their training programs, the old initiatory schools taught simple methods for redefining expectations and assumptions to give neophytes the confidence to tackle the much subtler and more demanding work ahead of them. As the New Age movement gained members and lost focus, though, gimmicks of this sort became the basis for a philosophy of cosmic consumerism that claims the universe is supposedly set up to give people whatever they happen to want, so long as they ask for it in the right way. It's a popular philosophy that sells exceedingly well. At its latest rehash, the current book and video phenomenon titled The Secret shows clearly enough. The problem is that beyond a certain point, the philosophy doesn't work in practice. You can try as hard as you'd like to convince yourself that the universe wants to give you whatever you want, but that doesn't mean you will get it. At that point, the monkey trap closes tight around your hand, because if the ideology you've embraced tells you that you have to believe completely in it to make it work, any awareness that it's not working gets shoved aside as an obstacle to success. Responses to this predicament in the New Age scene have covered the entire range of monkey antics, but one in particular bears noticing: the dramatic increase in the popularity of conspiracy theories in the New Age community over the last few years. Conspiracy theories start from the recognition that connections aren't always visible, that what looks random and disconnected often has a thread of purpose and meaning tying it together beneath the surface. That recognition is far from useless. In particular, it's a critical tool for making sense of today's global predicament, not to mention a necessary first step toward the ecological awareness that's our best hope of moving toward a more sustainable way of life. It's also a fundamental element in spirituality. Mystics and poets have been pointing out for thousands of years that everything is connected to everything else. As Wordsworth put it, quote, "Thou canst not pluck a flower without troubling a star," unquote. Here, as so often, though, the devil's in the details. While everything's connected to everything else, in any given context, some connections are more relevant than others. Some series of subtle links connect the peanut butter sandwich you ate last Tuesday with the state of your career, no doubt. But if you've got turned down for a promotion on Friday, the peanut butter sandwich probably doesn't belong very high on the list of the reasons why. If you don't want to discuss the more important reasons, though, the sandwich might just be a good way to talk about your career troubles instead of factors you'd rather not mention. Quite a bit of the conversation about fossil fuel depletion, global warming, and other aspects of the current predicament uses exactly this strategy. While I was writing this chapter, 5 minutes on an online search engine turned up websites making diametrically opposed but equally sweeping claims about the peak oil conspiracy, quote unquote. One website claimed that peak oil is a conspiracy being perpetuated by left-wing extremists who are trying to bring down the status quo by foisting a fake crisis on the world. Another website claimed that peak oil is a conspiracy being perpetuated by financiers who are trying to shore up the status quo by foisting a fake crisis on the world. Now, it's certainly true that some political activists have done their level best to hijack the oil depletion issue for partisan purposes, and it's possible that the recent run-up in oil prices was pushed in an attempt to pump more financial liquidity into a faltering world economy. These are, however, secondary factors. The driving forces behind peak oil are these. The world's oil reserves are finite. We've already used close to half the total recoverable oil on the planet. Every year since 1964, we've pumped more oil than we've discovered. Production at most producing oil fields is declining. New fields and alternative sources such as tar sands are barely filling the gap. The situation is more likely to get worse than better in coming decades. These hard physical realities provide the context within which activists, financiers, and everyone else make their decisions and pursue their goals. If liberals are manipulating peak oil to support a partisan agenda, or if the big investment banks are encouraging speculation in the oil markets, that's worth noting, and arguably worth criticizing as well. But neither the liberals nor the bankers can change the reality of peak oil. Still, if you don't want to talk about the reasons that you've got passed over for promotion, that peanut butter sandwich makes a good distraction. Listening to the space lizards. You can often make sense of a phenomenon by watching it in an extreme form, and I've had the opportunity to do that with the rise of conspiracy thinking over the last few years. In the small southern Oregon town where I live, he now lives in Cumberland, Maryland, but he wrote this back in 2008, which is when he was living in Oregon. Quite a few residents participate in the New Age movement. He actually lived in Ashland, Oregon. And a fair number of them are into the Baroque conspiracy theory launched a few years back by soccer player turned New Age guru named David Icke. Icke's theory claims that all the world's political, economic, and cultural leaders are actually evil lizards from another planet. This is admittedly only one of many popular flavors of New Age paranoia these days. Older and potentially more dangerous theories have also begun to surface. It's not precisely a comforting sign that Icke and several other New Age conspiracy gurus have written books that include the complete text of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a hoary anti-Semitic forgery that helped inspire National Socialism. Still, Icke's version of contemporary conspiracy theory will do as well as any, particularly since it has wide circulation these days in the New Age scene we've been discussing. The conjunction between Icke's brand of cosmic paranoia and the New Age movement may seem odd, since one of the core elements of the current New Age credo is you create your own reality. Why, you might wonder, would people who believe they create their own reality want to create one in which the world is ruled by evil lizards from outer space? Like most questions, this one contains its own answer, because there are at least 3 reasons why a world ruled by evil space lizards is more comforting than the one we actually inhabit. First, it's not your fault. If evil space lizards dominate our planet, it doesn't matter that your comfortable lifestyle depends on third world sweatshops and environmental devastation, or that the choices that you make are helping to guarantee your grandchildren a poorer life on a more barren world, because the lizards run the world and you don't. They're to blame, not you. Second, the world does what it's told. If evil space lizards control the world, that means the world is under control, and thus at least potentially under your control. The world around you loses its independence and becomes an object to be pushed around at will. You don't have to confront a universe governed by its own laws and momentum in which you, your desires, and your opinions aren't important. Third, you don't have to change your life. If evil space lizards are responsible for all the world's problems, then opposing the lizards is far more important than solving the problems. It's also much easier since it doesn't require you to give up unsustainable lifestyle choices. These advantages go a long way toward explaining why Icke's lizard mythology has become so popular on the far edges of today's zeitgeist. The same three ideas, though, play at least as large a role in the far less exotic versions of conspiracy theory that surround the current predicament of industrial society. Far too often, talk about the various manifestations of that predicament focus exclusively on who's to blame. Whether the target du jour is liberal activists, financiers, oil companies, or George W. Bush, the assumption seems to be that if only the right scapegoat can be found and punished, the problem will be solved. It won't, though. Criticism has its place in any healthy society. When it turns into a replacement for constructive action, on the other hand, it becomes wasted breath. And when it becomes a way for people to avoid dealing with their own complicity in the situation, it can easily become part of the problem it claims to address. That's true even if some of the potential scapegoats helped make the situation worse than it had to be. The shift from visionary mysticism to paranoid conspiracy culture makes sense when you read in the context of psychologist Carl Jung's theory of projecting the shadow. The shadow in Jung's psychology is the sum total of everything we don't accept about ourselves. We try any number of psychological tricks to keep from becoming aware of our shadows, but one of the standard methods is to project it onto someone else. Instead of owning up to the fact that we have characteristics we claim to despise, we see those characteristics in them, whether them is an ethnic group, a religious community, a political party, or what have you. The more intense our hypocrisy, the more forcefully we project our own negative characteristics on someone else, and the more savagely we hate the target for mirroring back to us, at least in our own minds, the things we project onto them. This process of projection is exactly what's going on in large parts of the New Age community today, with a twist. The shadow of the New Age is the reality of limitation. The hard fact that you can't always get what you want, no matter how much you want it. I'm going to say that again. The shadow of the New Age is the reality of limitation. The hard fact that you can't always get what you want, no matter how much you want it. Projecting that shadow, as Jung pointed out, is one effective way to deal with it, and conspiracy theories allow the faithful to project the shadow of their failure onto a fantasy of ultimate evil. In David Icke's theories, for example, the evil space lizards aren't just to blame for everything wrong with the world. They deliberately created and maintain the illusion, quote-unquote, of a material reality with real, inflexible limits. Thus, believers in Icke's worldview can maintain their faith in their ability to create their own reality. If it doesn't work in practice, that's because the space lizards are slithering around behind the scenes messing things up. The religion of progress. Now, all of this may seem to have very little to do with the themes of peak oil and social decline discussed in this book, but there's a direct connection. The myth of progress, like the belief that everyone creates their own reality, raises expectations that the real world simply isn't able to meet in an age of diminishing resources. The myth of progress, like the myth that everyone creates their own reality, raises expectations that the world simply isn't able to meet in an age of diminishing resources. As the gap between expectation and experience grows, so does the potential for paranoia and hatred. Those who cling to faith in progress, like those who believe they create their own reality, are all too likely to go looking for scapegoats when the future fails to deliver the better world that they expect. The emotional power of the myth of progress makes the quest for scapegoats a difficult trap to avoid. The claim that progress is inevitable and good has become so deeply woven into the collective thinking that many people nowadays simply can't get their minds around the implications of fossil fuel depletion, or for that matter, any of the other forces driving the contemporary crisis of industrial civilization. All these factors promise a future in which energy, raw materials, and their products, including nearly all of our present high technology, will all be subject to ever-tightening limits that will make them less and less available over time. Thus, we face a future of regress, not progress. The problem here is that regress is an unthinkable concept these days. Suggest to most people nowadays that progress will soon shift into reverse, and that their great-great-grandchildren will make do with technologies not that different from the ones that their great-great-grandparents used, and you might as well be trying to sell a medieval peasant that heaven with all its saints and angels isn't there anymore. In words made famous a few years ago by Christopher Lasch, progress is our true and only heaven. It's where most modern people put their dreams of a better world, and to be deprived of it cuts to the core of many people's view of reality. Even those who reject the myth of progress in favor of the myth of apocalypse draw most of their ideas from the faith they think they've abandoned. Like Satanists who accept all the presuppositions of Christian theology but root for the other side, or like that minority of feminists who argue that gender discrimination is bad when it privileges men, but good when it works the other way around, most of today's believers in apocalypse swallow whole the mythic claim that progress is as inevitable as a steamroller. It's simply that they believe the steamroller is about to roll its way off a cliff. The suggestion that the steamroller is in the process of shifting into reverse and will presently start rolling patiently back the way it came is just as foreign to them as it is to the believers in progress. It's not going too far, I think, to call belief in progress the established religion of the modern industrial world. It's not going too far, I think, to call belief in progress the established religion of the modern industrial world. In the same way that Christians have traditionally looked to heaven and Buddhists to nirvana, most people nowadays look to progress for their salvation and their explanation of why the world is the way it is. To believers in the religion of progress, all other human societies are steps on a ladder that leads to modern industrial civilization. From the standpoint of the myth, the other things our civilization happens to be good at are the things that matter, and the things our civilization has never been able to master don't count. Our kind of progress is the only kind there is, and the road to the future thus inevitably leads through us to future societies that will be like ours, but even more so. All of these claims are taken for granted as self-evident truths by most people in today's industrial societies. Not one of them has a basis in logic or evidence, like the doctrines of the Trinity or the Four Noble Truths. They are statements of faith. The religion of progress has a central role in driving the predicament of industrial civilization because the dead end of dependence on rapidly depleting fossil fuels can't be escaped by continuing on the path we've been following for the last 3 centuries or so. Almost without exception, the technological progress of the industrial age will have to shift in reverse as its foundation, cheap, abundant energy, goes away. Most of the social and cultural phenomena that grew out of the fossil fuel-powered technology will go away as well. The peak and decline of the world's oil reserves is the first step in this process, and the slower exhaustion of coal and other non-renewable fuels will complete it, setting the industrial world on a trajectory that will most likely lead to something like technology and society that it had before the Industrial Revolution began in the first place. Editor's note, this isn't even factoring in climate change, climate chaos. What will happen to the faith in progress is in an age of obvious technological regress, when cars and computers and footsteps on the moon all belong to the departed glories of the past. No doubt, some die-hard believers will claim that whatever changes happen as we slide down the far side of Hubbard's Peak are further evidence of progress. We've already seen the first wave of that among green tech proponents who argue that their technologies are more advanced and therefore more progressive than the competing alternatives. Still, it seems unlikely that many people will keep the faith. The religion of progress has maintained its hold for the last 3 centuries because it has delivered on its promises, filling our lives with technological marvels, wondrous enough to distract us from the cost to our world, our communities, and ourselves. I'll say that again. The religion of progress has maintained its hold for the last 3 centuries because it delivered on its promises, filling our lives with technological marvels wondrous enough to distract us from the cost to our world, communities, and ourselves. When the parade of wonders grinds to a halt, then, The impact on deindustrializing cultures may be immense. If, as I have suggested, progress is the unrecognized religion of the industrial world, the failure of its priests to produce miracles on cue could plunge many people into a crisis of faith with no easy way out. The recent vogue for conspiracy theories and apocalyptic visions of the future strike me as two clear signs that people are beginning to turn their back on the religion of progress and seek their salvation from other gods. Neither pursuing scapegoats nor waiting for redemption through catastrophe are productive as ways of dealing with the transition to the deindustrial age, but both of them offer a great deal of emotional consolation, and it's likely to take more than the usual amount of clear-headedness to avoid them in the difficult times we are likely to encounter in the near future. Peoples of the past, when stripped of their traditional faith in one way or another, have responded in many ways. Some launched revitalization movements to renew the old faith or to revive some older vision of destiny. Some embraced newly minted belief systems or traditions imported from distant lands, and some simply huddled down into themselves and died. We have begun to see examples of each of these reactions in the modern industrial world. Which of them turns out to be the most common may have drastic effects on the way the twilight of the industrial age works out, because the stories we tell ourselves will have an immense impact on the world we create at the end of the industrial age. Now, that whole last section, the last two and a half pages, called The Religion of Progress, is really important. So I invite you to stop, rewind for about 10 minutes, and then listen to it again. And then I'll go on to Chapter 3.
That's the end of Chapter 2 of John Michael Greer's 2008 book, The Long Descent. Continue to Chapter 3 on YouTube.